Hey everybody, happy Wednesday. I'm here making my commitment to show up every day. I'm just Jen. And my content is literally built around benzodiazepine and the entire psychiatric industry and big pharma and the damage that they've done. A lot of it now, I'm jumping off of Dr. Yosef. That's with the Josef. I'm looking at him right now. It's WITT, WITT hyphen Doring, DOERRING, psychiatry. And I think I saw his YouTube address at Taper Clinic or the Tapering Clinic. If you have ever struggled with psychiatric drugs, my thing is especially benzodiazepines. He is so worth the watch. I honestly believe he would have been censored not too long ago. The truth. And he speaks it with integrity about the psychiatric industry, of which he is a board certified psychiatrist. And he took that leap, and he has a lot of patient testimonies. Before I go any further, I do want to warn there is discussion about self-exiting ideology, attempts, and in some cases it actually happens. I'm watching him right now, and he has a Kelsey Krause on, whose husband had committed suicide last April, I believe she said. And what they went through and what I've been through, being so invalidated, being so lied to. And let me clarify, in my treatment, the biggest problems I've ever had with tapering, I haven't touched an SSRI in 30 plus years, and I never ever will. I can safely say never. But the benzodiazepine has been a long, slow, not even an attempt to taper until 7 years ago. And I am down to a certain dosage. I take it at night, at bedtime. My tolerance is so through the roof. All it does is keep the most horrible of those withdrawal demons and all the symptoms that come with that at bay. But I do think personal history has a lot to do with whether you're even bound to wind up seeing a psychiatrist. It happened to me by seeking out just regular therapy in 1997, I believe, and it had really, really changed by that time. They were all under a psychiatric group, and within 10 minutes between the therapist and her recommendation, might not need medication, but of course, if you do, it'll enhance our experience. Literally in that doctor's office for 10 minutes, really saw him much after that. But the litany of SSRIs, Klonopin right off the bat, 4 milligrams, that is ridiculously high. But to back it up, to those of us that might be more vulnerable to this, I'm going to say, mistreatment of psychiatrists, history has a lot to do with it. I think I was in a much more vulnerable place to actually seek out help, right down to just a therapist. I have 4 siblings. I was born into, my mother had 2 children. My older brother, God rest his soul, he passed of multiple myeloma in 2007, and her daughter, Karen, and their father had passed away. She met my father and had me and my one full-blooded, same parent, younger sibling. So there were 4 of us. And I think basically what happened with my mom, and let me say this right now, I loved my mother. I think about her all the time. She is gone, but somewhere down the road, she asked for my forgiveness as I became an adult. and we had a decent relationship, and she asked for it, and I willingly gave it to her, and I treasured the relationship we had before she had passed. Um, but something went terribly, terribly wrong for her, I think. As I said, she was a widow, and when she met my father, who's an alcoholic, she got pregnant with me. So back then, no, that was in '63. So you just got married, and he actually left a family of three children, and married my mom, and they went on to have my younger sister. They divorced around 8 years old, but backing up to even having me, um, the older sister was really in a place where I think, I'm just going to say it. She was really, really, I think to this day, she sees herself as above everybody and will look down her. Now, she has a side of her. Nobody is all good and nobody is all evil. She absolutely has a side of her that can be very loving, very generous, very helping. But that was never, ever my experience with her from the beginning. And she's beautiful, beautiful girl, just blonde and blue eyed and just a gorgeous girl. And I think my mother doted on her. And um, my mother getting pregnant with me and marrying my father was a huge inconvenience to her. Now, my older brother was just a love. I could do a whole video on him just alone because he was my one anchor in childhood, and he did everything in his power to protect me. There's only so far he could go. He was also a child of my mother. Um, and it's strange, but not that unheard of. You can have a parent that's a good mother or even their mother to your siblings, but there might be that one child in the family that she resents for whatever reason. And in my case, it was me. And this older sister also resented, like my father and me. Sure, well, matter of fact, I know a lot of attention had to be taken off her. My brother had always been just like a geek, genius geek, kind of independent, could basically take care of himself. I think he was only 11 when I was born, and she might have been around 8. But by the time like she got into adolescence, it was real obvious. She was on the abuse train with my mother. And here's where I'm going to talk about some uh, very serious abuse. So if that's a trigger for you, I'll give you a second. Move, move away. Go take care of yourself. Go do something nice for yourself. But starting as early as I can remember. In fact, one of my first conscious thoughts. So I can't give you an age as to when and I mean intense physical abuse began. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not adding anything on. Sometimes, I thought one incident of abuse I had just made up in my head, but later, when I was adult and having my first baby, my little friend, there was a family down the street, and they had, I think, a family of 10 or 12. And the one that was my age was around me a lot when I was little. And I thought I made this up in my head, but she recalls one point we were getting out of the car, my mother and I, and she was coming over to see me, and my head was being smashed. We had this flagstone pathway that led up to the back door, and my head was being like repeatedly smashed. And I'm screaming out to my little friend, help me, help me, help me. And she was just terrified. And she booked home, and she just wasn't allowed to come over like ever again. It was forbidden. And, it was she had a lot of friends that would stay overnight, and I was just never allowed to stay overnight, per her parents, and that's certainly good parenting on their part and taking care of their daughter. So, like I said, this was before elementary school. And I just remember severe abuse and neglect of only me. After the divorce, and this older sister kind of chimed in. The resentment was there from the beginning. I'd use the word jealousy, but it's more of just pure resentment that my mother did this and she married this man, and he is an alcoholic. I'm sure he was not a blast for her to live with, but you know what? Today it's kind of like, tough shit. It happened. Suck it up. Deal with it. And she is very close with my younger sister. So, but anyway, and like I said, this was just me. The four siblings, it was just me that was her target for whatever reason. And the physical abuse was just almost unspeakable. It's something today, she probably would have gone to jail over. And or I definitely would have got taken away from her, but she wound up abandoning me completely at 13. Once she found out that she could just sign me over to the state, sign custody over to the state, and not have to deal with it ever again, that's exactly what she did. She kept my younger sister and raised her. And although it wasn't severe, there was a lot of neglect. She would do things, and this is when I was still with her as well, like, take off with a boyfriend for the weekend and not leave any food or money, or, we didn't have cell phones back then, even a number in case of an emergency. We did have some relatives in the neighborhood. They were my older siblings' relatives. There were no blood relations to me. So profound beatings and profound abuse. The one that stands out the most is when she started going through the divorce with my father, and they just weren't getting along. He would call constantly during the day. If the poor guy would go to work and worry about his little girl. He had to work, and he knew what she did. So this older sibling can say what the hell she wants. He was looking out for his little girl, but I was clearly forbidden from picking up that phone. You know, I, I was surprised, like, she wouldn't force me to pick it up and tell him I'm just fine. That's what I wanted to do, even if I wasn't, just kind of ease his nerve. I remember I was real little, I'd get up with him real early in the morning, and I just loved to watch him shave and get ready for work. We had the old percolator, and then get his coffee going, and I just adored him. I just adored him. Alcoholism and all. There was just never a time I felt like he didn't love me. And he always provided what little he had at the time, or how much ever he had at the time, he was there. Or there certainly would have been times I was homeless. So after this very, very abusive upbringing, she basically just abandoned me. And I was actually forbidden to even come to the house on Christmas to see my little sister. Nothing. And of course, the oldest sibling was just thrilled about all of this. And yeah, did was I rebellious, and was I starting to give her a hard time as I got older? Well, of course. She literally beat the snot out of me as a tiny, tiny little kid. But going back to the phone thing with my father trying to check in, um, she was laying down. She was always laying down, always. Um, there's from the first grade on. I think she got me dressed and helped me the first day of school, the first day. And then I was just left to my own devices for everything after that. Um, Up until the time my father was in the house, I remember she did cook meals and she did feed us. We would actually, I remember a handful of sit down dinners with the four of us. All that stopped after the divorce. And I think what groceries she did bring in the house were basically for her. Um, I just remember being hungry. And I just remember months and months and months of there being nothing but hot dogs. And this older sibling having to babysat while she went to work at night. This is after the divorce, and there never being anything to eat. And I remember one where she got involved and was responsible for the abuse. You know, she was like 18, 17 or 18, and babysitting, and not too happy about it. She was kind of forced into it, like, an older sibling. Maybe today you would have called her parentified or whatever, but she was far from that. She just had a babysit a couple nights a week, me and my younger sister, who my younger sister just kind of avoided everything. She was just a good, quiet girl that, stayed out of the spotlight, where I was just more broken and I was the obvious target. But she's babysitting, and I'm trying to invite another little friend over for dinner, but her mother was very particular about her diet and what she ate, and couldn't be hot dogs. And sometimes, like, I'm talking gross boiled hot dogs and water on the stove, like no bun. Sometimes no, not even condiments, just like a hot dog. But I was also cleaning the house. I was constantly trying to impress my mother. That was one thing she was just wonderful at. She kept a beautifully clean home. We weren't loaded. At the time, we would have been considered middle class, but that's kind of faded out now. And, it was a little 3-bedroom ranch style house that her first husband had built. And then when she married my father, like, he completed it and paid things off. But so cleaning was a good way, or so I thought, to get her attention and get her approval. She was almost obsessive about it. And I remember one winter vacation, school vacation, all the kids and the cousins were outside in the snow having a blast. And I got up and I started cleaning from the time I woke up, and I made sure everything was perfect before I went to bed. She didn't even notice. But this night, this older sibling was babysitting, and there were many contributions of the abuse with her. And we had these models of ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, Columbus ships, and they were models. And, they had the sails, I would say they're about, the biggest one was about a foot, 12 inches. And there was I don't know what you call it on a ship. I don't know anything about ships. These are model things. But there was just a rod that came up to support the sails on these ships. And, they were a decorative thing downstairs in the finished basement. So I took them all off to dust into every nook and cranny, trying to avoid my sister, who was just like up there in front of the mirror singing, to the fifth dimension, and just clearly making her point. She was not available. If we needed anything, if we had a question, you know, if we wanted something, if we wanted our hot dog, it was like, get it yourself. She's really, really just horrible, horrible, horrible. Where the brother was just the exact opposite. But he wasn't around that much by then. He had met his wife to be, was kind of doing his thing. So we put these ships down on the floor and stood up on something to dust off the shelves. When I came to step down, this metal pole, that held the sails up, the arch of my foot, I stepped on it and it went up almost to the top of my foot. It was my first time in life, like, experiencing a pain I cannot explain. Blood squirting everywhere. I'm screaming for her help, begging, please, please, it's bleeding, there's blood everywhere. She actually yelled down, well, clean it up and get a Band-Aid. She went up to be a nurse too. Oh, God help her poor patients. But anyway, I was able, we had an extension, phone extension downstairs, and I was able to, like, literally hop on one leg, spreading blood all over the basement, to call my mother at work, who was also obviously very inconvenienced, but she did know it was serious enough. And I remember her trying to call my sister to, go check. And she was just like, just come home, you deal with it, they're your kids. That kind of attitude basically throughout my entire childhood. And she did. She left work and she brought me to the emergency room. And because it was so small, it was just literally like a poke, like a puncture, like probably about this big, and it stuck straight up and it went right up inside my foot. And she did leave work and bring me to the emergency room, which was a rarity. I think maybe we had medical insurance when my father was in there, and dental. And after the divorce, we didn't. So we had to be dying, like literally, for an emergency room trip. And I just remember there wasn't much they could do other than clean it. I don't remember whether they gave me something for pain or not. I want to say they probably did, but she didn't give it to me because I kept waking up all night with it throbbing, throbbing. It took days and days to subside. So, there were a lot of instances like that. She would either contribute in the beatings sometimes, she would do it herself. And it was just a horrifically bad situation. And then after she kind of abandoned me, and the state took over, so blessed. Shout out to you, Mary Ellen Babbitt. I had a social worker that was just really on the up and up, for one, and wanted to help and cared a lot. I don't know if I was her first client, but I was among the first few. But nonetheless, there's only so much they can do. So after I was married, I counted it up, and I think it was about 21 or 22 different, like, programs and foster homes. And I finally wound up in this state-funded high school where you live there and you go to your classes downstairs. The teachers drive into it. And, I got to say I was kind of blessed there in that it was a beautiful, beautiful place. It was like a hexagon building. They had a hairdresser that came in you could make appointments with once a week. The counselors were very, very kind. Absolutely no abuse, no shady stuff that you might expect to find in a state-run facility. And, plus that social worker was always checking on me, always following up. I did wind up just trying to run away so many times. But it was hell. It was hell. And but I wasn't to get on this train with the benzos and the SSRIs till long after I was fully healed for a long period of time. So, in the interim of that, kind of bouncing around, crashing with my father once in a while if I could, just hooking up, and just I would attach myself to any man I was doing. Basically, I needed them to survive, to live. And, one was particularly outstandingly abusive, but, they all were. I was a vulnerable target, plus I was young and hot, so it wasn't that hard. But and of course, drugs was slowly incorporated. Yeah, actually, they had been before my mother even had given me away. I was introduced to, all the standard kind of street drugs, and the biggest problem wound up becoming cocaine in the end. But, back then, pills were Quaaludes was still around, but pills were very, very hard to get. But I do remember, and I do remember the one or two times I was able to have free access, I actually overdosed. And again, I was at my mother's. She just happened to let me, this was later on in life, and she just happened to let me crash there. And this sister was pregnant, and whatever reason, I was out of my mind. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning. I had no, I wasn't cognizant. My times were really mixed up. Back then, I would think it's like 7 o'clock in the morning in the summer, and I want to go out and get the morning sun to tea, and it was actually 7 p.m. That stuff happened like all the time. And but I remember I just decided to start cleaning the bathroom. There was something about being around her. It was that desperately seeking her approval and acknowledgement by cleaning, because that seemed to be all she ever complained about, for one. If we made any kind of a mess, And I could get like seriously abused from that. But not with the other kids. I never saw her take a hand to any of my other siblings, and my younger sibling tells me now, no, it was more neglect, just sheer neglect. Checked out. I think she just had it with motherhood. By the time I came along, there was a gap between her older children and us, and then all the resentment of the divorce. Like I just had to absorb that. It was forced on me, and of course, I didn't understand what was happening back then. So drugs definitely came on the scene right before then, like around 12. And luckily, back then, anything like Valium, even, that was the only thing I had even heard of. Very, very rare, very, very hard to get. But I remember the first time I took it, and the euphoria was instantaneous. I just wanted to call everybody I loved and tell them to get this. Um, just the feeling of relief, And I've worked with a doctor. He had actually lost his medical license due to addiction and then got it back and now runs an entire recovery program. And he's even written a book. Just I think it's called Push and Turn, meaning the prescription bottle. And I asked him why people, get addicted to certain things. Why is it for some of us it's substance, for some of us it's sex, for some of us it's food, gambling, you name it. I know people say you can get addicted to exercise and health and bodybuilding and things like that. As long as you're not taking dangerous steroids. I don't even want to label that lifestyle as addiction because of um, the stigma that it brings up. So, yeah, if you're addicted to exercise, you go, boy, you go for it. Um, but yeah, so that was getting increasingly more throughout the years, and I finally met who's to become my first husband, and for the first time in all my using, I just had free access. Um, he's passed away, God rest his soul. He really was a wonderful, wonderful man. It just so happened we connected through using, and he always had it. And I'm not going to get into any legal shade with it because he was a beautiful person. We cleaned up together, and so I had free access now, and I just remember the day that I think it was divine intervention because a lot worse things had happened while using that particular drug. Of course, there were 1,000 nights where there's just no more and you can't go to sleep, and that depression of lying there, and the only guaranteed relief you had was falling asleep. I hated alcohol, never got into that. Um, but I always kept that in the back of my mind that those pills, those benzodiazepines, boy, they would be great for this. Kind of just cut it right off. But I'm glad. I'm glad they weren't available or accessible back then because I remember that moment of intervention from all these other drugs. And I was 22 years old. I had gotten my first apartment with this man that had all these drugs, who was later to become my husband. And I had been on another bender and kind of just sitting there awake for like 2 days. You don't go out of the house. You open the fridge, it's like ketchup and ice water. You have napkins kind of flopped over the toilet paper roll. Um, I smoked heavily back then, and you're just smoking those disgusting things out of the ashtray. And just that desperate feeling. I remember, you just go through all the papers and the rubbish to make sure you didn't miss a little bit, or something like that. It was very dehumanizing and very degrading. And this one morning, I knew what I wanted. I always knew what I wanted in my life. I wanted a family. I wanted a husband and children. And anything that happened after that was just a plus and a bonus. But that's what I wanted. And in that condition and with that upbringing and with that abandonment, the hopes of having a healthy one, were pretty grim until one morning. After 3 days of being on this bender, I was looking out my window, and it's about 8:30 in the morning. I had been up for about 2 days, and I was trying to force myself to go to the store to get cigarettes, but just going out was out of the question. The agoraphobia, which was to haunt me for different reasons many years later, was insane. But I'm watching cars just drive by, assuming, people are on their way to work. And I'm watching a bunch of kids at the bus stop with their moms waiting to get on the school bus. And I'm thinking, wow, these people have a life. You know, these women are getting up in the morning and getting their babies ready for school. Or I had never experienced anything like that, but I'll tell you, I was damn well going to be one of those moms. We had discovered, just to sidetrack for a minute, I had discovered by this point, my chances of conceiving were practically nil. I had an exploratory surgery, and there were just a lot of problems, and I probably was not going to be able to get pregnant, but I wanted to, and I always held out hope. You've heard the story a million times. Somebody keeps trying and trying. This was before like IVF was a thing, but they go and adopt, and the next thing you know, they're pregnant. Whatever the case was going to be, I hadn't given up hope. But like I said, 2 days up, not being able to go to sleep, that there's nothing left in the house, and no hope of it coming like for another 24 hours. And for whatever reason, I had horrible things happen while using. And this wasn't one of the big things you'd think, oh, well, after that, that will do it. No, it was just a typical addicted morning. There's no more access, and I'm watching life. And I'm remembering, by then, my whole family. There was just a total rejection, except an older brother who I would sometimes connect with. He refused to get on the bandwagon. This older sibling really controlled a lot of the show, including my mother, my younger sister, and tried to influence my older brother to no avail. But she was one of those people that she would threaten to withhold her love from you if you had anything to do with me. There was such a hatred there. We did make a connection after I cleaned up. I'll talk about that in a minute. But so in that moment, I just remember breaking down into tears. And all this was going on outside of me. And here I was in this little apartment, awake for 3 days, feeling at an all-time low, crashing from this horrible drug. And life was passing me by. I was only 22, but I still had that thing with my biological clock, and I want everything done by 25. I'm 62 now, so looking back on it, no disrespect to people in their 20s, but it just feels like you're a baby to me, and I realize you're full-grown adults and with families of your own and careers, but, and I just remember praying. And it was like, God, if you will lift this thing from me, if you will take this thing from me, I will take it and pass it forward, and I will mention you and how able you are to do this, and that was my prayer, and that was my thought. And I eventually fell asleep, and I woke up and decided I was diving into my first NA meeting, and dive in I did. Dive in I absolutely did. And a lot of wonderful things happened, including, which was very, very helpful, just based on the childhood trauma and the first year of recovery. I got some really good therapy and some really good counseling. My first one, was another member. We're not supposed to break anonymity, but he did go on to get his degree and become a counselor. Big biker dude, tattoos, somebody you think you would never relate to in a million years, that knew more about me than I knew about myself. And he was my therapist for about a year, and then it moved over to my PM. I can still see her face in my head. And she extended that to a woman's group meeting once a week, along with my 101. And of course, the psychiatric industry hadn't really hit big yet. This was in the 80s, and I'm sure it did in other places, but God kept me safe from those therapists. And they just really, really helped. And I went on to have a life that was so full of joy, a total reconnection with my family, including this sister from hell. And, yeah, it didn't work out in the end, but for the next 13 years, we definitely had connection. Although I think for her, a lot of it was guilt based and really shame based. I think she had a desire to control my narrative and what I told people and what her part in it was. So I think that's why she kept me so close. She still pulled a lot of shady shit, but that was neither here nor there because I was okay. I was okay. I trusted and relied upon God one day at a time. Went on to have a baby, a beautiful 10-pound baby boy after, I was 33 by the time that finally happened. Married to his dad, had bought my second home by that time. I had a profession and a career that I loved. Friends, the best of friends, except for one evil one. I wasn't able to really make that. I made the connection that she was really, really bad for me, but I think by that time I felt so close to her, and I just kind of loved her so much. As long as I could stay aware of what she was doing, and there were a few times I kind of brought her into accountability. But that's a whole nother video. She will be like a whole nother recent Tisa video someday, I think. But it was just a wonderful life. I eventually got my dream career. No, not college degree, high school graduate with some college, but I always wanted to work in law and just be around that, more on an administrative level. I would have been thrilled being a legal secretary, which I eventually became, and had to leave that job as the secretaries just weren't making enough money to independently survive. The office manager was fired from that firm, and one of the lawyers called me. This was about a year after I left there, and said, "Hey, that job's open. Go get it." So I wound up kind of being like a paralegal office manager for a smaller firm that then connected with another mid-sized firm. And I had like 21 employees under me and absolutely loved what I was doing. I loved being the boss, I ain't gonna lie. But I hired a lot of people I'm not recommending it, I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying, we help each other. We help each other. We support each other in every single way that we can. And it worked out great for me. My right-hand girl, she had a job in a mall for $6 an hour, and now she was in this law firm, and I made sure everybody was making decent money, and I was salaried. And then I met my son's father around that same time. And oh God, he was drop dead gorgeous. And I met him, through the program. He didn't have a year yet, and that's a thing in the 12-step program. People joke about the 13th step, but wait a year. If you're not in a relationship, don't get in one. If you are in one, don't get out of it. That's what they recommend. He didn't quite have his year, but I was ready to make my move once he did. And I kind of just coincidentally showed up at all the meetings he went to that I knew of. But long story short, I had an on-again, off-again relationship with him, but in the interim became very, very close to his mother. She changed my life in so many ways. She really is like the only mother I've ever known in terms of just nurturing, feeding. Feeding should be the sixth love language. There's five of them. I really think preparing food and feeding people is, especially for women, it's a love language. Um, and I just adore her. We lived with her in this time I was working, and and then to fast forward, I got pregnant very unexpectedly at 33. We eventually got married. I'm working full time. I was able to get unemployment on my maternity leave and work a couple of days for an attorney. So it worked out really good because I just got to enjoy that pregnancy, that miracle pregnancy. Like I couldn't wait for the next chapter and what to expect when you're expecting and to turn the page. And anyway, I had this beautiful baby boy. We got married. He picked up when I got pregnant. And till this day, he's never really put it down. So he was checked out, but I had it in my head I was going to have a nuclear family with a mommy and a daddy, a husband and a wife, and the children. I wasn't, I was 13 years into my recovery at that point, total abstinence, minus like a surgery, or I might have used a painkiller or something like that. And with the exception of, I think in those last few years, tramadol had just come out, but no worries there. It was totally non-addictive, and it was like the great new replacement for narcotics. That's a whole new video. But when my son got to be like 4 or 5, I remember, his needs were getting greater, and I already was dealing with so much guilt because he was a daycare baby and I had to work full time. His father, for all practical purposes, I was a single mom. He worked nights and he had a long-term girlfriend, and he just wasn't home much. And when he did, the fighting that this poor baby was exposed to was an absolute nightmare. And it was at that time I sought out therapy again. When I look back on it, people, please hear this. I was having a human response, a very normal reaction to lifestyle and what was going on in my life at the time. I was stressed as hell. This little boy had greater and greater needs. He, was getting into kindergarten. He needed more exposure to outside activities and more time. It wasn't, just an infant that I can feed and nurture and that slept. And trying to pull his dad in to become more committed and interactive and raise this child with me, it wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. They say it takes a village. So yeah, of course, it was a little depressing to know, I'm in this marriage, we have this beautiful boy, and you could not be less interested in either me or the baby at that time. And you definitely had somebody else you were interested in. I take marriage vows very, very seriously. Cheating is the ultimate worst offense that you can do to somebody. What that does, for me is just unspeakable almost. And then lying about it on top of it, that's even more unspeakable. But so I sought out help. And unfortunately wound up under the psychiatric industry. I wanted a therapist again. And I think I said at the beginning of the video, I got that, and within 8 minutes, I was on Klonopin and an SSRI, and over the next 10 years, I was to go through a litany of these SSRIs. It would be easier to list the ones they didn't give me, because every time I went in and told them, I can't do this. I lost my ability to work. Any energy I had went to this little boy. 6 years later, after I had him in 2001, I was to have another baby. And this was right in the middle of it. it'd been 6 years that I had been on all these SSRIs, and then they're telling me, like with a benzodiazepine, you can't abruptly stop that during pregnancy. And I didn't. Major low dose, and they tested him at birth. And, you know, um, don't take anything ever if you're pregnant. But it was, my midwife explained to me that, really only 10% might cross through to the placenta, and it just didn't. He was fine. They tested him. I had a midwife experience with him, which was absolutely beautiful, totally different than the first baby. There were a lot of complications in delivery with him. So now it's just a hot mess. Everything that I had worked so hard for and was blessed with in that recovery period was gone, including custody of that first child. you know, um, and these doctors, like if one more person were to tell me you need to take some more accountability and some more responsibility, which I'll do a whole video on that because we do have an amount of responsibility and accountability that we have to take. But these doctors were nefarious. They knew, they had to have known these drugs were actually harmful just based on the shit testing they did when they started marketing them. It's a lot like that whole, I don't know, and if you ever watched the Purdue thing, when they were pumping out OxyContin, it's a lot like that. They know it's damaging. The marketers know how to push it to the doctors, and there was no way the doctors didn't know. They are just like DSS or child services can be. They are rewarded, monetarily rewarded for pushing certain prescriptions at certain times for patients. So, and I was on the worst of all of them, in my opinion. Seroquel at one point, Cymbalta, all the new ones, and right up until putting them down, and I just didn't want to be treated by, I did, at 40 years old, I very foolishly, not knowing anything I know today, I just said, I'm going to self-exit. I had already lost everything. Every time I went, and this is the point I want to stress, they made me feel, first of all, the second you the first time you're being prescribed these things, you're already changed because now you knew you were a little depressed and you were a little stressed. And suddenly, 5 minutes with a psychiatrist and you're bipolar, you have major depressive anxiety disorder. Wait a minute. I was having a bad month. It was getting a little stressful. I was paying more attention to my husband and my marriage and knew like I needed to reel him back in. And he just wouldn't give up this relationship. He had picked up, and, on top of trying to raise my baby, I'm dealing with him going through rehabs and swearing that he's sober and going to meetings but still drinking, kind of a thing. It was just a nightmare. So automatically, before you even fill the prescription, you see yourself as totally different. Wait a minute, I have all these things wrong with me. And they both lull you in the beginning. Their game is, there's no shame in this. There's absolutely no shame whatsoever. It's just people go through this. There's a chemical imbalance in your brain. You can't blame yourself for that. You can't control it, and you have no choice. You didn't ask for this to happen. You get years into the games they play and the lies they tell and the harm they cause, and suddenly it becomes your fault. Like, oh, well, hey, doc, it's just getting worse. I want to self-exit. I had checked myself in to psychiatric hospitals, I think at least 3 times during this gamut, and that was even worse. The psychiatry that took care of me, I said took care of me. That's not what they did. But that was an even worse psychiatric experience. Not to mention absolutely zero help. More pills, more pills, more pills, more pills. Change of pills, upper dosage of pills, 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 pills. That's all they pushed. And by the time they've completely destroyed your life and messed you up, now it's your turn to be accountable and responsible. It's not their medications. It wasn't their diagnoses. It's your abuse of and there was absolutely abuse of the benzodiazepines in the beginning, until I came to fully understand what happened to me. And I'm going to say this, before they victimized us. And that is exactly what happens to us. They will make you feel so degraded, and when the medications aren't working, it's your fault. It's your disease. It's your disease. Oh, especially if you get a bipolar diagnosis. A very common symptom of bipolar is denial of the disease. It took an evil genius to come up with that one. An absolute evil genius. And I remember they would have me repeat it like a mantra, but all the entire time, my focus was on the benzodiazepines. It was the only thing I knew out of everything they gave me. I knew they were doing something in terms of making it worse, but at least with the benzodiazepine, I could actually feel it. I could feel the relief. I could become functional for a little while. So that was my goal. And the only reason I kept going back. And at 40, talk about what happened when I just literally flushed down every single SSRI. I think I was up to seven different medications, one doctor, one therapist. This wasn't like running around doctor shopping. Although my primary would help with the benzodiazepines. Finally, at the end of it, I had a prescriber that prescribed them by the week. So there was no way I could run out, and they would always fill it 3 or 4 days early if I did, but I was able to get through a week. And if I could get a refill that next week, that was fine. That was keeping the demons off. And in another video, I will tell you my full experience of trying to go off the benzodiazepines per the standard of care through psychiatrists. They ought to be ashamed. They ought to be ashamed. Dr. Yosef, we need more like you. We need access to you. That's the biggest problem. Most of us don't have access to a good provider, homeopathic doctor, osteopath, a board-certified psychiatrist that is a real psychiatrist that understands the dangers of these drugs and understands how to taper people off and give you your life back. They're hard. I talked in another video about Dr. Jordan Peterson. If you're familiar with him, he's all over YouTube. He's famous, academic, just bright, wonderful author. And he had an experience with these that was so horrific. You could actually see it play out on his videos and on X and things like that. And, he's talked openly about his own journey. And all I know through Dr. Yosef is he eventually, when he came off the benzos, like his life just went haywire. And this is a possibility, and this is a risk with them. When that happens, and then you go back on them, it could actually make it worse, or just not do anything. Like with him, they tried low doses, they tried high doses, nothing was working. He was staying in that same state. He was locked into it, and that's my biggest fear, because age is a factor too. It's one thing if you've been on them for 10 years and you're in your 30s. I think a faster taper and a total cutoff is not only possible, but a good thing to do. I have a lot of questions at 62 and knowing what I've experienced, although, I've done a very, very, very slow taper over the past 7 years. So that's it for today. I think history matters. You're going into it with a lot of trauma, most of it had been healed, like I said, my mother asked for forgiveness at when I was an adult, and I gladly gave it to her. I had a relationship with her before she passed away, but my life was just, everything had been taken from me at that point. No, I didn't give it away. And I have talked previously about what I was responsible for. It wasn't a whole lot, and I will boldly fight like toe to head about that. I was victimized like many of us, all of us. I think if you've ever seen a psychiatrist that prescribes these drugs when they have no history, after a 5-minute appointment, you're now part of their greedy, grubbing, money making shit science scam. It's a game. I can see an end in sight. I think with Kennedy heading up Health and Human Services, I know right now he's very focused on food and vaccines, but there's no way he's not going to take a look at this. And most of you psychiatrists out there, you're going to have to find another way to make your money. You know, I look at Dr. Whit Doring, and just YouTube alone and the information he offers, I'm sure he's making a good living right there. And then the tapering clinic, God bless him. May you become a billionaire because you deserve. I'm just looking at him now. I have a parasocial relationship with him. There's just no doubt. I have found so many answers, and I had come a long way with learning about this and how they function, and where it starts at the top of the pharmaceutical companies and how it trickles down, and how you and I become victims of literal torture. Yeah, I've now just heard it over and over again, and that's the way I would describe benzodiazepine withdrawal. Literal hell. You just say you feel like you're being tortured is really putting it mildly, and it's not an exaggeration. And now, because of doctors like Dr. Yosef and the testimonies, I'm hearing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients that have had this experience. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to the bigger majority of us. And just the physical, and I would always describe it before I heard from the testimonies for the I don't know if they're patients, but they give their testimonies on Dr. Yosef's channel. I always described it as if you've ever seen like a wire short circuit, or a computer crash or something like that. But when it was happening, I always visioned in my mind like a wire that had burnt and was giving off electrical sparks, like you get a shock if you touched it, or if you ever got an electrical shock. But it was never ending. It was 24/7 going off in my head, just boom, 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 light, 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 flat electricity, stab, pain everywhere. The physical pain, the digestive issues, the vision problems, as bad as they were. And on a scale of 1 to 10, they got a 25. But the psychological part of it, that short wiring you feel going on in your brain, the agoraphobia, it's a nightmare. And it resulted in an improper tapering, or an attempt to get off them. There was several throughout the years before I got to where I am now. So, like I said, I'm going to keep showing up here every day. Please, 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 my benzo groups, I'm making the link, or I'm figuring out how to make the link and put it on my groups. Bind is a really good one. There's just a lot of, I found them through Facebook. And I'm trying to put those links on there. I did a live on one because I'm down with this. I think the chances of it ever going viral are nil. But I'll tell you, if this was ever monetized, my commitment would be to get access to help like Dr. Yosef, or like whatever happened to Dr. Peterson. He wound up going somewhere and actually being put under anesthesia. I don't know what they did for him, but he sounds and looks great now. But to have I would use that to access that care, although I'm in a pretty stable place right now. and definitely send as many people as possible to these real doctors, these real actual doctors that have some integrity and that know how to feel shame and don't do anything where they would have to, that aren't disgusting and repulsive, cold and uncaring and disrespectful and dehumanizing, like the majority of them are. And I want to talk on the next video specifically. I've stayed away from psychiatry as much as I can on this benzodiazepine taper. Sometimes you get stuck with it because you just need the prescription to be provided. And that's what happened after having a provider that wasn't in the psychiatric industry. It was that wellness, that doctor I said, who became addicted and then got his practice back, and he's kind of devoted himself. I think mostly for people hooked on narcotics. He's devoted himself to like Suboxone, but they will see other patients, ADD. And this is a good sign too. When you're seeking medical help and you're under like a company or there's an overseeing doctor, your first appointment, your first consult should always be with that overseer. If they're just pushing you right in with any provider and you never even know the doctor, that's a red flag, a big red flag that you need to pay attention to. But I met with him first and he gave me like an hour-long appointment, answered all my questions, and and then I went to my visits, I went to his PA. But there was a time before that and a time after that that I had to go through a psychiatrist just to get the medication to keep me on my taper. Once you start that tapering program, and I'll do a video on that, it's very, very important that you keep your dosages where they're supposed to be. If you have some nut job wacko psychiatrist that wants to cut you off because you pissed him off by telling him the truth, or like with Klonopin, I've spoke about this, the urinalysis are coming back negative for Klonopin only. That's in another video that you can watch. I'm going to try to title these better so people will know what the topic is. But anyhow, that's all for today. I got to get back into my own routine and get out there walking. I'm just real passionate about this. You are not alone. I believe that psychiatry is going to be brought into the age of accountability very, very soon. In the meantime, listen to the ones like Dr. Yosef. I'm just kind of jumping off his content and with my own personal experience mixed in there. So Godspeed to all of you. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye now.